Today we're going to run down my favorite miniature painting tools and supplies of 2021. These are not necessarily the best value supplies or even the best supplies. It's just a list of things I liked and found myself using on a daily or weekly basis in 2021, so take that as you will. My favorite overall glue that I used this year was Gorilla Super Glue Gel. It's widely available, has a bit of a thicker consistency than most super glues, which I find a bit easier to work with, and the top dispenser tends to clog less than other super glues that I've used. And when it inevitably does clog, you can use your old one to refill your new one, so that's nice too. My favorite plastic cement for this year was Tester's non-toxic cement for plastic models. It's cheap, non-toxic, a bit less watery than the other plastic cements, so it's less likely to spill or get everywhere. I just like the form factor of this one. My favorite overall basing material for 2021 was plastic snake skeleton from Dollarama. This is a classic basing material that's cheap, easy to work with, and adds some much needed snake skeleton to your larger bases. My second favorite basing material for this year was Vallejo basing paste. I know, basing paste is just sand mixed with PVA glue and paint, but this video, remember, is not about the best supplies for your money. It's just about my favorite supplies. And I happen to really like basing paste. I use it on a regular basis, and I like that I can use this stuff not just for adding texture to bases. It's also sticky enough that it works kind of like a glue, and I can add anything I want on top of it afterwards, such as some plastic snake skeleton, or various rocks and other pieces of debris I might want to put on the base. The airbrush that I use for everything I do is the Iwata HPCS, otherwise known as the Eclipse. I've owned this thing for over 5 years now, and it's never once quit on me. And that one time it did quit on me, it was definitely my fault for handling the needle improperly. However, to the company's credit, it was really easy to replace the broken parts online for I think it was $10 a part, which is pretty cool that I don't have to buy an entirely new airbrush and I can just buy any of the individual parts that I need to replace on it. For my airbrush compressor, I use this one. I believe the brand is Master Airbrush, and I bought it a long time ago from TCP Global. It's really nothing special, but it does do the job well, and it's worked for me for 5 years now, or however long I've been using it. I would provide a link down in the description, but I think this model is no longer made anymore, but I will provide a link to the store where I bought it, and maybe you can find a similar one. My favorite overall primer is Badger Stynel Res Matte Black Primer. This stuff works great through an airbrush or as a brush-on primer if that's your thing. And my runner-up in this category is Vallejo's line of their various surface primers. These work great when I want a primer that's gloss black for undercoating metallics, or on the off chance I want a white or other colored primer. Speaking of white paint, my favorite overall white paint for 2021 was Liquitex Titanium White ink. I use this for all of my zenithal highlighting through an airbrush, as well as on my palette for a great thin down white that doesn't get too chalky. In fact, I use so much of this stuff so frequently that I have an automated subscription set up on Amazon.ca. And speaking of Amazon, you can find Amazon affiliate links to all of the products in this video down in the description below. And when I say affiliate links, I mean they give me a very slim cut of the profit if you buy anything through them, so make sure you buy now. Buy from Amazon.com. The only thing Liquitex white ink isn't good for is dry brushing. And in these cases, I just use whatever white paint I have on hand, whether it's from my Army Painter set or my Vallejo set of white paint, or pale sand. My favorite new thing that I added to my painting routine in 2021 was incorporating CITADEL contrast paints into my paint schemes. Yes, obviously they're overpriced, but these 6 contrast paints I found were especially invaluable to me as someone who does a lot of glazing and speed painting. Combined with some airbrush thinner, these things work great through an airbrush, and combined with a few drops of glaze medium, they work perfect for glazing on your models. My only real objection to contrast paints is their gluey texture and, of course, the price, both of which appear to be solved by Army Painter's new line of contrast paints, AP Speedpaints, that will be releasing early next year. If you'd like to see an in-depth look at these new speed paints, you can check out my previous video, which I have linked somewhere, probably up here. Of course, contrast paints are not good for everything. In fact, they're only good for specific use cases. So I'd like to tell you about my 12 most used hobby paints which are not contrast paints, just normal hobby paints. But before we do that, I'd like to tell you about my absolute favorite miniatures company in all of North America, as well as the sponsor of today's video, Broken Anvil Miniatures. Broken Anvil is a small team of artists based out of Seattle, Washington, who are extremely passionate about miniatures, terrain, and tabletop games, and I think it really comes through in everything they do. In fact, I'm just gonna call it now, I think that their new skirmish game, Rivenstone, is going to be the most popular skirmish game of 2022. So just calling it now, but we're not advertising Rivenstone today. Maybe one day soon though. We are advertising the Broken Anvil Patreon. For just $9 a month, you can get over 50 pre-supported miniatures, as well as a 5th edition compatible adventure module. And all of this is of course based around the fictional Arctic island of Scarcrest. If you pledge this month for only $9, you're gonna get a ton of these cold weather themed orcs, kobolds, wyverns, kobolds riding wyverns, wolves, and maybe even a massive frost dragon like I'm painting in this video today. In addition to this, you get an expedition team of these little penguin guys, as well as their walrus buddies, and a bunch of terrain to represent their base camp, as well as the local environment of all of the other creatures. Personally, this is my favorite set of miniatures they've ever done, and I'm actually planning to get a full set of these miniatures printed for use in my home games of Frostgrave. So if you'd like to get some of these miniatures for yourself, go and check out patreon.com/brokenanvil or brokenanvilminis.com. You won't be disappointed. Anyway, for my main everyday paints that I use through an airbrush or with my regular brush, I tend to prefer Vallejo Game Color or Model Color, and occasionally Army Painter. I usually thin all of these down with some Vallejo Glaze Medium or water. By the way, Vallejo Glaze Medium, still my favorite glaze medium. But these 12 paints are the ones that I find I use on almost every project. These would be my go-to paints if you asked me for a painting starter set, and it's probably going to be the paints that show up in my Hobby Basics series if I ever finish that series. I use acrylic washes a lot less than I used to on my models, mostly because contrast paints have replaced acrylic washes for me in most cases, but there are still these 4 CITADEL shades that I wanted to include here on this list because I find I still use each of them quite a lot. This is probably just because I know these 4 paints so well that they serve a very specialized purpose for me, but I just wanted to include them here to let you know that they're still on my list of favorite paints. My absolute favorite ink in my paint collection, aside from titanium white ink, is Daler-Rowney Fluorescent Pink. If you've watched any of my videos, you've seen me use this paint a lot, sometimes known as Curios Hair Pink. It's just a really solid fluorescent pink, which is sort of glazy in consistency, similar to a contrast paint almost. It's definitely like next to Pale Sand, probably my favorite paint of all time. I don't use many other inks in my painting process, except for through an airbrush, which I use a lot of inks through my airbrush. And when I do that, I think my favorites have got to be the Liquitex acrylic ink line. They're widely available. I tend to prefer their consistency versus their Daler-Rowney equivalents. They're also reasonably priced and you can just order them off Amazon, so I tend to use Liquitex inks through my airbrush whenever I'm trying to do broad colors through an airbrush. For metallics, I typically stick to just 3 shades of Vallejo Metal Color. These work great in most cases, including through an airbrush. These are a bit more expensive than other paints, but they do come in pretty large bottles, and I haven't run out of any of these colors since I bought the initial bottles of them. So I would generally recommend them. I think they're pretty good value. The only thing they don't really work well for is dry brushing metal. And when I am dry brushing on metal, I'm not really picky about what I use. I usually just use whatever metallic I have lying around from Army Painter or Vallejo. I don't really have a preference. For painting, I pretty much exclusively use one palette, and it is the REDGRASS wet palette in XL size. It's one of the biggest wet palettes on the market. It's aesthetically pleasing. I like the sponge and papers it comes with. The old papers are pretty good, but I like the new papers even more. My favorite brush that I used in 2021 was the brushes from REDGRASS Games, specifically their number 2 brush. I've enjoyed quite a lot of brushes over the years, and my go-to for quite a while was a Winsor & Newton watercolor brush that I still have linked down in the description. But REDGRASS have just started to send me free brushes in the mail every few months to keep me topped up, so that's what I've been using, and I have been pretty satisfied with them. This is starting to sound like this video is sponsored by REDGRASS Games, but I promise it's not. They've only actually sent me a few things for free. Most of the stuff I actually buy from REDGRASS myself. My favorite painting handle of 2021 is also from REDGRASS Games. Prior to getting these, I was happy with just using a piece of wood to stick my models to, but as soon as I purchased these, I actually found that they're the only thing I want to use for painting. Not really for their form factor, but more for their unique feature, which is that the tops are removable. So I don't need a new painting handle for every model I'm painting. Let's say I have a batch of 10 models I want to paint. I can just put them each on one of the toppers and then alternate them out on top of the painting handle. I also really like that you can rotate the painting handle, which works really well if you're filming your painting process. Anyway, that's about it. That's the last REDGRASS product in this video. I thought I would bundle them all together. Finally, my favorite miscellaneous accessory from 2021 is my Ikea painting cart. When I had my big injury this year, I wasn't able to immediately work in this studio because I'd made a big mess in here and I wasn't able to easily clean it up when I had a big wrapping on this hand. So I wanted a solution so that I could have all of my painting supplies in different rooms of the house. The solution that I went with was just this $30 rolling cart from Ikea with a $20 nail polish organizer on top. The way I use it is I keep all of my most used paints and accessories on the top organizer, and I keep the stuff that I use less often back on the supply wall back there. So if there's a paint on the cart that I find I'm not using that often, I'll end up putting it back on the wall. And if there's a paint from the wall that I find I'm using really often, it gets promoted to going on the cart. I really like that I can just move this around from room to room. If I want to do a larger project in the living room, I can easily bring all my most useful supplies with me. I had originally planned to use the bottom two shelves for something more useful, but right now it's just where I put stuff that doesn't have a home yet. So it's kind of my inbox for things I need to organize and find a permanent home for. So that's about it for today. Thank you so much to Broken Anvil for sponsoring this video. If you'd like to get your own copy of any of these wonderful models from their Expedition to Scarcrest set, you can do so at patreon.com/brokenanvil. And while we're at it, I would also like to thank all of my patrons for sponsoring me all the time to make these videos. Thank you very much. And this week I would especially like to thank Roll 1 to Explode and Matthew Morrissey. Thank you so much for watching my favorite supplies of 2021. Let me know if you have any questions about specific supplies I mentioned in this video. All the links to these things are down in the description, as I said before, and I hope you have a wonderful holiday season. And I will see you in the next video.